Going to be looking at some findings from the perspectives of some tutors from various projects, but also some findings from some other projects that are going on in this time. And essentially the key message, I think, is that these findings have, they're aware of the fact that nowadays dealing with student mental health is an inevitable role of being an academic and a personal tutor. So briefly, we're going to talk about some of the change in trends of student mental health in higher education and the role that the personal tutor has within the context of being student mental health. With these, as I said, we're going to look at a few experiences from personal tutors from the RARA project, from what we've collected so far, but then we're also going to look at some other projects that have come out quite recently and are already trying to suggest some of the changes that we can do to improve the way that academics are supported in their role of supporting student mental health. We're then going to take a minute to reflect on some of the skills and experiences that we all already have. So whilst this talk is in the context of personal tutors supporting their students, this whole day has been about reflecting on the skills that we already have and the experiences that we do. So we're going to spend some time where I'll get you to think about, similar to some of the work that we've done already today, get you to think about some conversations that you've had when you talk about mental health and how you think that works well or what you can do differently. At the very end, we're going to talk about some of the longer term changes needed in the sector because the other ongoing theme here is that it's not going to be changed overnight. So some of the new policy reports that have come out are already suggesting some of the things that have to happen in the longer term. But then to end on a high, we're going to also talk about some changes that we can do right now. So the awareness of the increasing demand and severity of student mental health has been rising for some time. It's not new news. Particularly in the UK, we've had a lot of change with new policies coming in, but we've also had a lot of societal changes as well. And that basically means that the makeup of our student body is changing and the types of distress that they experience is changing. And at the same time, through various government initiatives such as the Widening Participation Scheme, we also have far more students coming to university with pre-existing mental health conditions. But the issue with that is that a lot of our services and a lot of the support resources and a lot of the training that our staff has is geared up to suit the traditional student, and we've got more non-traditional students coming in, so we need to think about diversifying some of the support that we've got there. So here's some work that I did before this project. This is looking at 113 university counselling services in higher education, further education and sixth form colleges across the UK. We've done these years in particular because shortly after this year, the 2013-14, this would be the first cohort that would have been affected by the tuition fee rise. And what we can see is that yes, overall we're seeing that we're getting more students referred into student counselling services, but we're also seeing that when we look across the sectors, when we compare higher education against further education and sixth form colleges, it is particularly acute in higher education, and there's been an accelerated effect since 2013-14. And so one of the reports that came out recently, this Not by Degrees by the IPPR, they're basically recognising this as this has coincided with a lot of the things in the media at the minute that's coming out. And essentially their key message is that as the student population is starting to more closely represent the sort of the wider demographic and socio-economic backgrounds of the people outside of university, it's inevitable that we've got more people experiencing poor mental health at university. But the issue with it being a university is that that poor mental health, if it's not supported well, that has a knock-on effect to their ability to engage with the academic culture at university. And that has a knock-on effect as to the opportunities that they have when they're there and the outcomes that they have too. So when we look at the types of mental health that students are experiencing, we can see that there is a wide range. So here we have a various range of student mental health issues, from depression, social anxiety, general anxiety disorder, which is the GAD, and then also some more student-specific experiences down here, so substance abuse, hostility, distress. And basically the darker the bar, the more severe the issue. And what we see is that time and time again, we see these reports coming out that students, they're depressed, they're anxious, they've got lots more social anxiety, lots more general anxiety. But what we also see is that they can still function, and that it doesn't mean that if a student is struggling with their mental health, it doesn't mean they also can't perform academically, in the same sense that if a student in these grey bars here, so if a student has no mental health concerns at all, that also doesn't mean that they are able to academically perform as you would expect them to. And so we've come to a time where a lot of these changes in policies and in the societal changes that we're having, that education, unfortunately today, no longer acts as a buffer against poor psychological health. It used to. There was a time when it was, but we're not in the day where that is the case anymore. And we also find, again, unfortunately, that students now graduate with poorer mental health when they exit. So when you measure their mental health before they come to university, so this is catching them sort of when they're still in schools, in sixth form colleges, when we measure their mental health before they come to university, measure it throughout university, and measure it when they leave, it does not return to the state of mental health that they had before they come into university. And then what we also know is that there are certain characteristics that can make students more likely to experience some of these disadvantages. And some of those characteristics we look at here are things like being an ethnic minority student, being a male student, being a mature student, which again, there are a lot more other changes happening with higher education at the minute where we do have more mature students coming to university. We've got more carers and more students commuting to university to make it cheaper, and we've got more students who are estranged from their parents. And some of the reasons, particularly when we bring it back to RARA, some of the reasons why this is the case is coming back to the idea that a lot of the support we have is geared up for traditional students. And so when we look at some of these characteristics, we are finding that they are disproportionately deterred by stigma and some of these other barriers that don't need to be there. And so why personal tutoring? Well, we know that, as we said earlier in Sam's talk first thing this morning, that a personal tutor is someone on a student's course who knows them and is someone who's looking out for them. We also know that students prefer pastoral support, so they are going to their tutors when they have an issue with their well-being or their mental health. And we also know that they prefer this type of support to be delivered by academics within the faculty. They want to be part of the faculty. So we know that positive relationships do influence student outcomes in general, and we know that they may foster a sense of belonging. But we also know, so coming back to my previous point, where students are now, education is no longer a buffer against poor psychological health. What is forming social relationships. We know that having a social connection, feeling like they belong at university, this can protect students against mental ill health. And so we also know that the role of a personal tutor can help them with their student to discuss some of the barriers to learning that they have, and not only in learning, but in accessing some of the other support options that they also may do. And if they can identify some of these barriers, then they may be able to pick it up early and encourage accessing these support resources early. And then finally, we also know that an academic or a personal tutor does seem to be the first port of call for almost any issue that we're seeing nowadays. And so this is one of the reports that came out by Student Minds earlier this year, and essentially they interviewed 52 academics, so 52 personal tutors, on their experiences with handling difficult conversations and their experiences with students experiencing mental ill health. And so what is quite nice is that this report essentially says that it recognises that personal tutors are almost a sort of invisible frontline. So they are admitting to the fact that responding to student mental health problems is now an inevitable yet invisible part of being an academic nowadays. And we'll talk about some of the guidelines at the end that relate to the second point, but essentially the report says that the HE sector doesn't currently have the appropriate structures in place or the cultures that we need to assist this type of change. And so in the various interviews at this project, in the project of the 52 academics, when they asked academics, how do you feel in your role of supporting a student with a mental health concern? Some of the answers that we got, some of the most answers that the report got, was that they're unclear. They're not clear what their role is in general. They're even less clear about what their role is when it becomes about a student mental health issue. Not surprisingly, we also found that they feel unprepared for the additional demands on their role. Now, this isn't just about time. This isn't the added demands of tutors supporting students with non-academic issues. It's also preparing them emotionally and preparing them with the fact that they may well have to have a difficult conversation with their student, and they're just not prepared. linked to this, as a result of that, they feel like they're not sufficiently supported in terms of dealing with a lot of these issues that students are bringing to them. And unfortunately, there's also some barriers there because they don't necessarily feel like they can access support for this because there is a disconnect between our embedded student counselling services and the support resources we have there. There's a disconnect between them and other areas within the institution. So this brings us back to raising awareness, raising aspirations, and these are some quotes that I've taken from some of the interviews that we've done from the baseline phase. And I'll also point out that mental health in the transcripts that we've been looking at has been popping up quite a lot in RARA, but we haven't directly asked any questions about student mental health when these have come up. These have just come up in the examples that they've said. So at the top here, we've got a tutor explaining a scenario. So usually this particular tutor would only support their first year students, and then when the students go into their second year, they're turned over to someone else. But here we have an example of where we have a third year student repeatedly going back to their first tutor because they disclosed something about their childhood that they do not want to repeat that story. They don't want to have to go to other tutors to do that. At the bottom here, we've got some reference to the fee rise and actually saying that sometimes it's the best option for a student's mental health is to take a leave of absence, is to decide to leave university. But we've got personal tutors saying, well, it's really difficult to have that conversation when it's so expensive to go to university nowadays. How do you say that the best thing for you right now might be to interrupt your studies when they're spending so much money on tuition fees to try to get an education? And then this big quote at the end here, it's just reflecting a lot of the things, mirroring a lot of the things that's coming up in the report from Student Minds, saying, well, I personally wouldn't feel equipped to deal with these issues in this nature. So mental health might be a challenge because, again, we haven't really had a lot of training. We'll talk about training a little bit more later. So we've talked on a few perspectives of personal tutors and academics, and I thought it'd be a good time now in the sort of theme of the day, reflecting on what we already know, to reflect on some of the skills and experiences that we might know and what we can potentially use them in different contexts. So think about a student or a friend or a family member who you recently had a concern, who recently approached you, who had a concern about, it might be their mental health, it might be their physical health, their well-being, maybe you know someone who's stressed at work or at home. Now, when you think about that conversation that you had with that person, so someone who came to you, why do you think they came to see you? And what does that tell you about the relationship that you have with them? And in terms of how that went, do you think they'll approach you again in the future? When you were in that conversation, what were some of the things that you noticed about their behaviour? Did you know they were going to come to see you to talk about something difficult? What changed in their behaviour? What was their appearance like? What was their use of language like? And in that moment, how did you feel? So again, we're saying that personal tutors, it's inevitable, it's part of their role to support students with mental health issues. But are we preparing them to deal with that? Do they feel confident? Do they feel uncertain? So what would you do again with facing a similar situation? What worked well, what didn't work well? And at the very end, and almost most crucially, did you talk to anybody else about it after? So often, us in our daily lives, but also personal tutors, we have people bring in these issues to us and we want to help them and support them in some way, but then that's a lot to take on for you as well. So where's your support in this? And this is quite interesting with the Raising Awareness, Raising Aspirations project, because the way that which those support mechanisms are set up in the different institutions that we're looking at are quite different. So at Sheffield, we just have personal tutors. At King's, they have an additional role of the role of a senior tutor, where there's this sort of additional network of support where personal tutors can go. And what's really interesting is that when we're looking at some of the transcripts from Sheffield compared to King's, is that a lot of the staff at Sheffield are sort of saying, I don't really know where to go with this. I feel like I'm speaking to my students and I feel like I'm helping them, but there's a lot, when I leave work on a Friday night or whatever, it's on my mind over the weekend. What support do they have and how can we better support them? So when you were thinking about your example, in this activity just now, these are some of the things that might have come up. So you may have thought about active listening. And in the context of being a personal tutor, I'm sure you're all aware, it's important to practice active listening because it helps the person to feel valued and validated. Students need to be at the centre, or in your example, the person, the family member that you're talking about, they need to be at the centre. They need to feel understood and they need to feel like they're in control. And in relation to that, in terms of them having the control, we also need to acknowledge the differences between what might you want to offer compared to what they might want to do or what they feel is feasible to do. And again, be clear. So it's quite clear that in the personal tutoring context, it's unclear what we're expecting them to do in terms of supporting students with mental health issues. And so if we were more clear on that, then we can help to manage student expectations. So if it isn't appropriate for them to go to their personal tutor about something in particular, where is it appropriate for them to go to? And then lastly, 5, 6 and 7, seek help and advice from others. So I'm really intrigued to see how some of the findings come from the relationships between the tutors and the senior tutors from the King's data, because it's important to seek help and advice before it becomes an issue or before it becomes a crisis. One of the things, so 6 is a difficult one because it's really easy to say, even though you're busy, follow up on your agreed actions. But what comes through our student engagement activities is that this is something that they really value. And coming back to Kay's activity later, it makes them predictable. It builds that relationship, it builds trust. So even though you know your senior academic, your senior lecturer is incredibly busy, you really feel valued if they can come back to you. And then again, notice the feedback and the positives so we can build some hope and confidence in our students. So these are some longer term solutions. So these come from a range of different policy reports. We do have a reference list that we can give out at the end. But these have also come from some work that I've learned from during my PhD and also from what we've learned from the Raising Awareness, Raising Aspirations project so far. So I mentioned earlier that training is a contentious topic because yes, we want to make sure that our personal tutors are supported and prepared, but with that comes more responsibility. And with that, I think it actually adds to the ambiguity of the role. So are they a personal tutor to deliver academic support, pastoral support? What is the extent of that support that they're meant to be given when it starts to go down the line of being about students' mental health? Build links between academic faculties, academics and student support services. So in all of our student engagement work, our little slogan is, when did you last see yours? Or when did you see your personal tutor last? But actually, we also need to be asking these questions to academics and saying, when did you last engage with anyone from your student support service? And the same, we need to be going to the service and say, when did you last have a meeting? Or when did you last make contact with some of the academics that are dealing with the things that you're dealing with too? And number 4, we need to recognise that it is an unavoidable role that academics do now have to deal with, handle difficult conversations and work with students that may potentially be experiencing mental ill health. So now on to this side. In terms of managing student expectations, this brings it back round to being clear of what your role is and making sure that we're aware of what those boundaries are. So when I've been on various bits of training that we've done at Sheffield, so supporters, it's okay to say, I think you need to see somebody else about this. I will help you through it. I will go to the service with you. I will have a look at these online resources with you. I will do this with you. But I think it's very important to recognise what the boundaries are, because all that time that student is spending repeatedly coming back to see you, they're not necessarily receiving the help that they should be getting, because the personal tutor may not be the most appropriate role to deliver that. And that's fine to be clear about that. And again, I quite like number 6. I was talking about this quite a bit in the lunch break. We need to encourage and empower students to engage with the student experience, but also to empower them that this isn't something that we're doing to them. Their mental health, their well-being is them, it's their thing. We're not just going to put them in on a program and say, right, great, you're fixed. It doesn't work like that. It needs to come from within. We need to empower them and encourage them that they can seek these supports, but also to engage with the student experience, because there is a lot of emphasis about getting a degree, getting a job, about the academic side of things. But as we learned earlier, we know that one of the best ways of protecting someone against mental ill health is to have a sense of belonging, is to have a social network. And so we need to make this clear to students. And I mentioned this earlier, so I'm going to repeat it now, number 7 and 8, because they're almost some of the most simple. Just have early conversations about mental health. It's okay to talk about mental health, and it's a really good thing to talk about mental health with students, but also with other academics.